I used to think my living room was a sanctuary of peace, but that night it became a crime scene where my future was murdered in cold blood. As a licensed therapist, I'm trained to listen for the unspoken, but I never expected the man I loved to look me in the eye and casually admit he'd been a ghost for months. David didn't just quit his job. He retired on my back without asking. As I sat there, the silence in the room wasn't peaceful. Numbing coldness radiated from him as he sprawled on the sofa. I paid for sipping wine I bought, essentially telling me my hard-earned life was now his playground. But the real knife to the heart came 4 months later. With a smirk of pure entitlement, he leaned in and said, "Relax, Katie. We're basically married anyway." He thought that sentence was his victory lap. He thought he had successfully trapped a successful woman into being his permanent safety net. What he didn't realize was that he wasn't talking to a victim. He was talking to a woman who had already begun his psychological autopsy. You are about to see how a professional who heals minds for a living goes about breaking a parasite. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It is a masterclass in calculated, cold-blooded revenge. Stay with me until the very end, because the trap I set for David involves a twist so humiliating and a payoff so legally perfect, it will change the way you look at love forever. He wanted my life. Fine. I decided to give him exactly what he deserved. My name is Katie, a 36-year-old licensed marriage and family therapist who has spent the better part of a decade helping people navigate the wreckage of their own choices. I have built a career on the foundation of emotional intelligence and a life in a quiet, affluent suburb of Connecticut that mirrors the professional stability I project to the world. For years, I believed I was the one who held the map to the human heart, never suspecting that the man sharing my bed had spent months drawing a map of his own, one that led directly to my bank account. My home was always my ultimate masterpiece of clinical order and personal peace. As a therapist, I spend my days absorbing the heavy, unwashed grief of others, which makes the sanctity of my own space non-negotiable. Every evening, I would walk through my front door and let the world fall away. The air was always curated to perfection, carrying the faint, soothing scent of lavender and eucalyptus that acted as a sensory reset for my weary brain. Soft jazz usually played from the hidden speakers, the kind of melodic, unobtrusive piano that filled the silence without demanding an ounce of attention. Everything was in its place: the heavy linen curtains, the hand-thrown pottery, and the rows of leather-bound books that promised wisdom. This was more than just a house. It was a sanctuary where my mind could finally stop analyzing and simply exist. However, that evening, as I stepped into the foyer, the lavender scent felt cloying and the jazz sounded like a funeral march for a life I didn't know was already dead. David was in the living room, but he wasn't just there. He was occupying the space with a newfound aggressive permanence. He was sitting on our cream-colored Italian leather sofa, the one I had saved for 3 months to buy, with his feet up on the mahogany coffee table. In his hand was a glass of the expensive Cabernet I had been saving for our anniversary. The sight of him should have been comforting, but instead it felt like a drop of ink falling into a glass of clear water. I watched as the contaminant spread. There was a dish of half-eaten olives on the table, a stray sock on the rug, and an aura of heavy, unearned relaxation radiating from him that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. I greeted him, expecting the usual recount of his day as a senior project manager, but David didn't look up immediately. He just swirled his wine, watching the legs of the liquid coat the glass with a terrifyingly calm focus. The conversation began not with a bang, but with a shrug that felt like an earthquake. He told me with the same tone one might use to remark on the weather that he had quit his job. He didn't use words like resigned or laid off. He simply said he was done, and then he added the detail that turned my blood to ice: he had actually left the company 4 months ago. My mind, usually so quick to process trauma, stuttered. 4 months. In that time, we had gone out to dinner, planned a summer trip to Italy, and discussed our shared future as if he were still a contributing member of our partnership. He hadn't been looking for a new position. He had been pretending to go to work, leaving the house with his briefcase only to return and spend my money while I was busy helping others heal theirs. What struck me most wasn't the financial deception, though. That was staggering. It was the complete and utter absence of anxiety in his voice. There was no apology, no trembling of the hands, no frantic explanation about burnout or mental health. He wasn't a man in the throes of a midlife crisis seeking support. He was a man stating a new law of physics. He expected me to cover everything, the mortgage, the utilities, the country club fees, and his lifestyle, as if it were my privilege to do so. As I stood there, still wearing my professional blazer and carrying the weight of my client's tragedies, I saw the anomaly of indifference in full bloom. His lack of shame was a neon sign flashing a warning I had seen in 100 toxic relationships before, but never in my own. He was testing me. He was leaning his full weight against the boundary of my love to see if it would hold or if it would crumble into total subservivity. I felt the familiar shift in my brain, the one I usually reserve for the office. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't even drop my keys. Instead, I retreated behind the glass wall of therapist mode. I began to observe him as if he were a case study rather than my fiancé. My clinical mind took over, cataloging his every movement with a cold, detached precision. I noted his predatory comfort, the way his limbs were draped over the furniture, not in a way that suggested rest, but in a way that suggested a flag planted in conquered soil. He was reclaiming the space I had worked so hard to create, asserting a dominant presence that relied entirely on my silence. He looked at me, waiting for the explosion, his eyes flickering with a dark curiosity. He wanted to see the exact moment I accepted the burden. In that silence, I realized that David wasn't a man who had lost his way. He was a man who had finally found exactly where he wanted to be perched, safely on the shoulders of a woman he deemed strong enough to carry him. I thought about the thousands of dollars that had flowed out of our joint account over the last 4 months. Money I thought was being supplemented by his salary, but was actually just my own life force being drained away. I looked at the man I was supposed to marry and saw a stranger, a parasitic entity that had successfully installed itself into the machinery of my life. He was waiting for me to say it was okay to offer words of comfort, to tell him we would find a way. He was waiting for the host to accept the parasite. But as I watched him take another slow, entitled sip of my wine, I realized he had made a fatal professional error. He had forgotten that a therapist's primary job isn't just to listen, it's to identify the infection and cut it out before it kills the patient. He wasn't confessing a mistake, he was conducting a field test to see exactly how much weight my shoulders could hold before I snapped. The days that followed David's revelation didn't bring a sudden explosion or a dramatic packing of suitcases. Instead, they ushered in a period of suffocating, incremental erosion that I can only describe as the creeping deficit. As a therapist, I had spent years warning my clients about the boiling frog syndrome, where the temperature of a toxic situation rises so slowly that the victim doesn't realize they are being cooked alive until it is too late. Now I was the one in the pot. It began with small, almost invisible shifts in our daily rhythm. We would go out for a quick Sunday brunch, and David would pat his pockets with a look of well-rehearsed frustration, claiming he'd left his wallet in his other jacket. Then it was the groceries, then the dry cleaning, and eventually the utility bills simply sat on the counter until I paid them out of sheer necessity to keep the lights on. The most insidious part of this transition was his use of what I call the language of praise. He didn't demand that I pay. He made it seem like a tribute to my superior competence. He would wrap his laziness in the silk of a compliment, telling me how much he admired my financial discipline, or how my career was so much more meaningful than his ever was. By elevating my status as the provider, he was effectively demoting me to his permanent benefactor. He turned my professional success into a weapon against me, suggesting that because I was so strong and capable, it was only natural that I should carry the heavy lifting while he found himself. It was a masterful bit of psychological theater, transforming his parasitic behavior into a testament to my own greatness, making it feel almost petty of me to ask for a contribution. While David was busy hollowing out the interior of our relationship, he was simultaneously constructing an elaborate fortress of public opinion on the outside. This was his community mask, a meticulously crafted persona designed to serve as a social insurance policy. Every morning while I was at the clinic listening to the heartbreaks of strangers, David was out in our neighborhood performing the role of the quintessential good man. He was suddenly everywhere, a blur of helpfulness and charm. I would come home to find him finishing up a repair on Mrs. Gable's garden fence, or helping the young couple across the street carry their heavy packages. He spent hours volunteering at the local park, planting marigolds, and chatting with the retirees about local politics. He was building a narrative where he was the kind, selfless, slightly struggling soul, and I was the high-powered, busy professional who barely had time for her neighbors. He was strategically securing his witnesses. He knew that if I ever tried to sever our tie, the community would look at me with cold judgment. They wouldn't see a woman protecting her boundaries from a fraud. They would see a cold, successful woman abandoning a man who spent his days fixing their fences and tending to their gardens. He was making sure that if our world ever split apart, the pieces would all fall into his lap. I watched him from the kitchen window leaning over a lawnmower and laughing with a neighbor. And I realized he wasn't just killing time. He was preemptively painting me as the villain in a story he was writing for our entire street. The true depth of his betrayal, however, wasn't hidden in his neighborly smiles or his empty pockets. It was tucked away in a side pocket of his leather messenger bag, a bag he'd been carrying for months to maintain the illusion of employment. One evening, while he was out grabbing some fresh air with a neighbor, I found a document that shifted our situation from a domestic crisis to a legal battlefield. It was a lease agreement for a boutique consulting office in the city, an expensive space I had never seen and certainly never authorized. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read the fine print. David hadn't just quit his job, he had used my stellar credit score and our joint information to co-sign the lease as a silent partner. He had forged my digital signature on a multi-year commitment that would cost tens of thousands of dollars money he clearly didn't have and never intended to pay himself. He wasn't just a lazy fiancé who had lost his ambition. He was a fraudulent partner who was actively sabotaging my financial future to build a kingdom for himself on my ruins. The legal stakes were now terrifyingly clear. By linking my credit to his unauthorized business venture, he had tied a financial noose around my neck and handed me the other end of the rope. He was counting on my professional reputation and my fear of scandal to keep me quiet, believing that a therapist whose own life was a fraud would never dare to speak up. He thought he was building a dream, but as I stood in the quiet of my office, clutching that paper until my knuckles turned white, I realized the horrifying truth of my reality. I wasn't just paying for his dinner anymore. I was unknowingly funding the very cage he was building around my life. The discovery of that unauthorized lease felt like pulling a single loose thread, only to watch the entire tapestry of my life unravel in my hands. I waited until the following evening to confront him, choosing a moment when the house was at its quietest, hoping for a flicker of the man I thought I loved to emerge and offer an explanation that made sense. But as I laid the documents on the mahogany coffee table, David didn't flinch. He didn't even stop swirling his wine. Instead, he leaned back the mask of the helpful neighbor and the charming fiancé, dissolving to reveal something cold, sharp, and predatory. There was no apology for the forged signature or the secret office. There was only a chillingly calm entitlement. He looked at me with a smirk that felt like a physical blow and told me that I was overreacting to a shared business venture. When I reminded him that we weren't married and that he had no legal right to my credit or my name, he laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed through the room. He told me that after 6 months of him maintaining the house, being the face of our couple in the community, and living as a unit, we were basically married anyway. In his mind, the passage of time and the shared meals had transformed my hard-earned assets into communal property. He wasn't just claiming a seat at my table. He was claiming ownership of the table itself, implying that his service as a domestic partner entitled him to my financial protection indefinitely. It was a villain's monologue delivered in the comfort of my own home, a declaration that he viewed my life as a resource to be harvested rather than a partnership to be honored. This revelation triggered a survival instinct I hadn't used in years. As a therapist, I have access to a network of professionals who deal in the shadows of human behavior, and by the next morning I was using every connection I had. I needed to know who was really sitting on my sofa. What I found was a shadow that stretched back much further than our 2-year relationship. Running a deep background check under his social security number revealed a history of aliases and a trail of emotional and financial destruction. David was a serial parasite, a man who specialized in finding successful independent women and slowly bleeding them dry under the guise of a supportive partner. But the most horrifying discovery was a name that appeared in a civil suit from 5 years ago, Elena Vance. Elena had been a client of mine, a brilliant architect who had suffered a devastating nervous breakdown after a bad breakup left her bankrupt and broken. She had never named the man, too ashamed of how easily she had been manipulated. Seeing his previous alias linked to her case turned my blood to fire. This was no longer just about my mortgage or my credit score. This was about professional justice. He had hunted one of my own, a woman I had spent months helping to rebuild, and now he was trying to do the same to the woman who had helped her. The stakes shifted instantly. I wasn't just a woman scorned. I was an officer of the Court of Human Decency, and I was going to ensure he never had another victim. Despite the rage vibrating in my marrow, I knew that an emotional outburst would be my undoing. My attorney, a shark-like woman who specialized in high-asset fraud, was blunt in our state. David's basically married claim wasn't just arrogance, it was a strategic opening for a palimony suit. If I kicked him out now, he could claim he had sacrificed his career to support mine, using the neighbors' testimonies of his home maintenance to drain me in court for years. I had to be smarter. I had to play the part he expected of me. I chose to adopt the strategic silence, a psychological maneuver where I became the version of the gullible, supportive fiancé he believed he had mastered. When he spoke of his consulting dreams, I nodded with a forced smile. When he mentioned our future investments, I didn't argue. Internally, however, I began the process of gray rocking. I stripped our interactions of all emotional caloric value. I became boring, unreactive, and predictable. I stopped sharing my day, stopped offering my insights, and stopped providing the emotional supply he craved. I became a flat gray surface that gave him nothing to grip onto. To David, it looked like I had finally submitted to his will, that I was simply a tired woman accepting her fate. He became even more comfortable, even more arrogant, believing he had successfully broken the therapist. While he lounged in the false security of my perceived submission, I was secretly dismantling the bridge between us. Every day was a performance. I would sit across from him at dinner, listening to him brag about his influence in the neighborhood, all while I was secretly recording our conversations on a device hidden in my necklace. I met with my fraud attorney in the back rooms of quiet libraries, handing over spreadsheets of every penny he had diverted and every lie he had told. I was building a legal iron dome, ensuring that when the strike finally came, there would be no ground left for him to stand on. I watched him walk through my house with the swagger of a landlord, unaware that I was counting down the hours until his eviction. I watched him charm Mrs. Gable over the fence, unaware that I had already begun to subtly document his forgetfulness and odd behavior to her daughter. I was a ghost in my own life, a silent observer waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim my sanctuary. He thought my quietness was a white flag, a sign that I had finally given up the fight for my own autonomy. He thought he had won because he had silenced the therapist's voice, never realizing that a therapist is most dangerous when she stops talking and starts truly watching. He thought that sentence was his victory lap, but for me, it was the opening bell of a war he wasn't prepared to fight. To a man like David, silence is always interpreted as submission, a blank canvas upon which he can paint his own version of reality. He spent his days lounging in my home, convinced he had finally tamed the therapist, unaware that I was merely using the very tools of my trade to construct a psychological mirror that would eventually shatter his reflection. The centerpiece of my strategy was the honey trap diary. I knew David's entitlement extended to my most private thoughts. He had a habit of hovering near my desk, his eyes lingering on my stationery. So I began keeping a leather-bound journal in my nightstand drawer, deliberately leaving it just slightly askew so I could tell if it had been moved. Inside, I didn't record my anger or my discoveries. Instead, I wrote a fiction designed to feed his deepest greed. I penned long emotional entries about how David's unwavering support during my supposed stressful period had made me realize he was my true partner. I wrote that as a wedding gift, I intended to put his name on the deed of my house, making him a full co-owner of everything I had built. I watched the payoff through a tiny motion-activated camera I'd hidden among the books on the shelf across from the bed. Seeing him hunched over the drawer, his face illuminated by a phone flashlight, was a revelation. I watched as he read the entry about the deed, his lips curling into a predatory, satisfied grin. There was a glint in his eyes, a raw, naked hunger that confirmed he wasn't just staying for the comfort. He was staying for the kill. By giving him the hope of total ownership, I gave him a reason to stay complacent, ensuring he wouldn't look too closely at the ground shifting beneath his feet. While David was intoxicated by the fantasy of owning my home, I was performing a surgical financial quarantine to ensure he would never touch a cent of my real wealth. Behind the scenes, my lawyer and I were working with a speed and precision that David couldn't have imagined. I moved my primary savings, my retirement accounts, and the title of the house into a protected, irrevocable trust, a legal fortress that effectively removed them from my personal estate. I quietly canceled the supplementary credit cards I had issued in his name, the ones he hadn't yet maxed out but was clearly saving for a spree. To David, everything looked the same. The lights were on, the fridge was full, but the bridge between my lifeblood and his appetite had been severed. More importantly, I began a series of recorded casual check-ins. I would sit with him on the porch and gently bring up job openings or local consulting gigs I'd heard about. David, buoyed by the belief that he was soon to be a homeowner, didn't even bother to lie anymore. I captured him on record laughing off the idea of a 9-to-5, stating clearly that he had retired early and that it was my joy to support him. He was handing me the evidence of his parasitic intent on a silver platter, documenting for the court that his lack of contribution was a choice, not a circumstance. I was building a legal Iron Dome, a multi-layered defense system that would leave him with no claim to support and no place to hide when the final blow was struck. However, I knew that David's most potent weapon was his community mask, the nice guy persona he had sold to my neighbors. He had already begun his counter-offensive, dropping subtle hints to Mrs. Gable and the young couple across the street that I was overworked and emotionally unstable, preemptively discrediting anything I might say later. But he underestimated the power of a therapist who knows how to plant seeds of concern without ever making an accusation. I began my own neighborly intervention, but I didn't go to them with anger. I went with concern. During our morning walks or over the fence, I would sigh and mention how worried I was about David's memory lapses. I'd tell them how he seemed to forget whole conversations, or how he would stare into space for hours looking confused. See, I framed it as a possible early onset issue or deep-seated burnout, asking them to keep an eye on him for me because he's so proud he won't admit he's struggling. By the time David tried to tell them I was the crazy one, the neighbors were already looking at him with pitying, skeptical eyes. They didn't see a hero. They saw a man who was losing his grip on reality just as I had intended. I was neutralizing his social insurance policy, making sure that when I finally stripped him of his mask, there wouldn't be a single person left in our zip code who believed a word he said. Watching David move through my house now was like watching a fly crawl across a web, convinced it was the master of the threads because it couldn't see the spider waiting in the corner. He walked with a new swagger, an unearned confidence that made him even more careless with his words and his movements. He truly believed he had outplayed me, that my supportive fiancé act was a sign that I had finally accepted the inevitable. Every night we would sit at dinner and he would talk about our future renovations, while I would sit there nodding and smiling, my mind miles away in a courtroom where he was already losing everything. I had turned my entire life into a clinical experiment, a controlled environment where David was the subject and I was the observer. The emotional pain of his betrayal hadn't vanished, but it had been repurposed into a cold, diamond-hard focus. I was no longer the woman whose fiancé quit his job. I was the architect of his downfall. I realized then that the most dangerous thing you can do to a man who lives on lies is to give him a version of the truth he's too greedy to question. Clarity is a dangerous weapon when the person you're fighting is convinced that you're still lost in the woods. The weeks of strategic silence and carefully measured compliance led to a night I had choreographed with the surgical precision of a master conductor. To David, it looked like the culmination of his greatest con, but to me, it was the final stage of a long overdue removal. I organized what I called a surprise anniversary dinner at our home, inviting our closest friends, colleagues, and the very neighbors David had worked so hard to impress. I wanted his witnesses there not for my benefit, but to ensure his social insurance policy would be canceled in front of a full audience. David arrived home that evening to a house filled with the warm glow of candlelight, the clinking of expensive crystal, and the scent of a catered feast that signaled the wealth he believed was now his. He was radiant, almost glowing with the arrogance of a man who believed he was about to cross the finish line. He had seen the deed entry in my fake diary only 2 nights prior, and his eyes were constantly darting toward the mahogany desk in the corner, expecting the legal document that would solidify his ownership of my sanctuary. I stood at the head of the table wearing a sharp midnight blue silk dress that made me feel every bit the powerful, successful woman he thought he had tamed. As I raised my glass, the room went silent, the tension thick and palpable as everyone looked from me to the man they believed was my devoted partner. David straightened his tie and leaned in, wearing a smile of pure, unadulterated greed, waiting for the words that would officially make him the master of the house. I began the toast by thanking everyone for being there to witness a moment of absolute clarity. I spoke about the importance of honesty and the courage it takes to truly see someone for who they are, regardless of the mask they wear. Then I reached beneath the table and pulled out a beautifully wrapped gift box adorned with a silver ribbon. I handed it to David, my voice remaining steady and calm, devoid of the shaking rage that had fueled me for months. This was the gift of truth. As he eagerly tore into the paper, expecting the legal deed to our home, the room watched with bated breath. But as the lid came off, his smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated. Inside the box was a thick, leather-bound folder containing the full fraud report from my private investigator, the documented evidence of his 3 previous identities, and a formal, court-ordered eviction notice. I didn't scream or throw wine. Instead, I began to speak with the clinical coldness of a therapist delivering a terminal diagnosis. I narrated his history of parasitic behavior to our guests, detailing how he had hunted Elena Vance and how he had spent the last 6 months trying to do the same to me. I explained the basically married claim and how he had forged my signature on a commercial lease. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of David's ragged breathing as he realized the woman he thought he had mastered had actually been dissecting him the entire time. David's reaction was a textbook study in narcissistic collapse. He tried to pivot his eyes welling with fake tears as he looked toward the neighbors, attempting one last time to play the victim of a stressed and unstable woman. He claimed I was making it all up, that he was the one who had sacrificed everything for me. But I was prepared for that, too. I pulled out my phone and tapped a button on the Bluetooth speaker. The room was suddenly filled with David's own voice, loud and clear from the recording I'd made on the porch weeks ago. The guests heard him laughing about how easy it was to bleed the therapist dry, and how he had retired the moment he moved in. The sound of his own arrogance echoed off the walls, stripping away the last of his community mask. Mrs. Gable looked away in disgust, and the young couple from across the street stood up, their faces etched with horror. David turned to me, his face contorting with a sudden, ugly fury. But before he could even stand up, I reminded him of the wedding paperwork I had asked him to sign months ago, the documents he hadn't bothered to read because he was too busy feeling invincible. In his greed to secure a partnership, he had signed a formal waiver of all domestic claims and an acknowledgement that he was a transient guest in my home with no rights to stay. He had no legal standing, no claim to support, and absolutely no right to remain on my property. The end came with a quiet professional efficiency that left no room for further drama. I signaled to the two men who had been waiting in the foyer a private security firm I had hired to ensure the transition was seamless. David looked around the room, searching for an ally, a friend, or even a sympathetic glance, but he found only a wall of cold indifference. His neighbors, the people he had spent months manipulating, were now watching him be escorted out like a common intruder. He tried to grab his leather messenger bag, the one that held the fraudulent lease and his broken dreams of a consulting empire, but I had already had his belongings packed into trash bags and placed on the sidewalk. As he was led toward the door, he looked back at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and hatred, realizing for the first time that I had never been lost in the woods. I had been the one who planted the trees. I stood in my foyer, the scent of lavender and the soft jazz returning to my senses as the contaminant was finally removed. I felt a profound sense of relief, not just for myself, but for every woman who had ever been told that her strength was an invitation for someone else's weakness. He didn't just lose a meal ticket that night. He lost the only thing a predator truly needs to survive his anonymity. The weeks following David's removal brought a silence to my home that was no longer heavy with the static of suspicion, but light with the profound air of a long-awaited spring. The theater of his deception had been dismantled, and in its place, a quiet, immovable truth remained. I watched from the safety of my sanctuary as the natural karma of his own choices began to unfold with the slow, inevitable weight of a falling tide. Without my credit score to bolster his fantasies or my home to provide a stage for his performance, the legal and financial reality David had spent a lifetime outrunning finally caught up to him. Because I had filed a comprehensive formal report for identity theft and financial fraud, David's real name, and the dark trail of aliases he had used to ruin women like Elena Vance, was now etched into a permanent public record. He couldn't simply move to the next affluent suburb and start again. He had been flagged in the very professional and legal circles he relied on to find his next host. A few months later, I heard through a colleague that David had tried to run his consulting entrepreneur scam in a city 2 states away, but he was met with a closed door before he could even cross the threshold. My report had preceded him. He was now seen working a grueling night shift at a massive distribution warehouse. His hands calloused and his face lined with the exhaustion of actual menial labor. The youth and charm he had used as his only currency were rapidly depreciating assets, and without a victim to sustain him, he was finally experiencing the accountability he had spent his life avoiding. He had tried to retire on my soul, but he had ended up bankrupting his own future. However, a survivor's story doesn't end with the defeat of the villain. It truly begins with the legacy they build from the wreckage. I realized that simply going back to my old life was an impossibility, for I was no longer the same woman who had let a stranger into her garden. I decided to pivot my entire professional practice, specializing in a field that I realized was desperately underserved financial recovery for women. I used the significant funds I had saved by cutting David out of my life money that would have been drained into his fraudulent lease and lavish lifestyle to seed a nonprofit organization I called the Boundary Project. We don't just talk about feelings. We teach high-earning, successful women how to spot the financial grooming and emotional predators that target their independence. I reached out to Elena Vance, the client David had broken years before, and together we turned her story of collapse into a curriculum for survival. Seeing her stand in front of a room of women, her voice strong and her head held high, was a greater victory than any court order. I had turned my personal trauma into a collective shield, fulfilling a masterpiece arc that moved beyond my own kitchen and into the lives of hundreds of others. I wasn't just a therapist anymore. I was an architect of defense, ensuring that the strength of women like me would never again be mistaken for a weakness to be exploited. The final piece settled over my life not as a return to my old self, but as a graduation into a higher state of awareness. The story ended exactly where it began, in my home, with the scent of lavender and the soft, unobtrusive jazz filling the rooms. But the air felt different now. The order and cleanliness were no longer just a clinical preference. They were a trophy of a battle won, a testament to a sanctuary that had been successfully defended. When I look at my reflection in the hallway mirror, I don't see a woman who was fooled or a victim who was lucky to escape. I see a woman who was tested by a master of manipulation and proved herself to be the ultimate strategist of her own destiny. I see the lines around my eyes not as signs of stress, but as the map of a journey through the woods that led me to a much brighter clearing. David thought he could use my empathy as a trap, but he forgot that a therapist's greatest skill is the ability to see through the noise to the core of the problem. I have built a life that no parasite can penetrate, and a peace that no lie can ever disturb again. I have reclaimed the mahogany coffee table, the expensive wine, and the quiet Connecticut evenings. But most importantly, I have reclaimed the narrative of who I am. I am the woman who looked into the eyes of a predator and chose to be the one who survived. The jazz continues to play a steady melody of independence as I sit in my living room and realize that the most beautiful thing about clarity is that once you have it, you can never be convinced to be blind again. The house is quiet, but it is a full, vibrant silence, the kind that only comes when you are finally truly alone with a person you actually trust yourself. I think of the thousands of women out there right now sitting in similar living rooms feeling that same cold ink of suspicion beginning to spread through their clear water. I want them to know that the boundary isn't a wall to keep people out. It's a gate that you alone hold the key to. My life is no longer a sanctuary of order built on a foundation of hope. It is a sanctuary of truth built on a foundation of iron. I have closed the book on David, but the lessons I wrote in the margins will stay with me forever. He came to take my life, but in the end, he only succeeded in teaching me how to truly own it. If someone tells you they love you but requires your silence to survive, ask yourself, are they your partner or are they just a ghost trying to live in your skin? The weeks following David's removal brought a silence light with truth. He ended up bankrupting his own future while I founded a nonprofit to protect women. Subscribe to join our community. We value your opinions. Have you ever faced a parasitic partner? Share your thoughts below to empower others today.